toward a rich, diverse, and united community that includes and uplifts and appreciates Muslims from a variety of races, cultures, and ethnicities. And again, if we have friends and allies who are people of other faith or no faith, but of just social conscious, just be aware that, again, if I'm correct, the Muslim American community now constitutes the most racially diverse Muslim faith community in the United States. And to be truthful, that is a challenge amongst ourselves. I think no one here would deny that even the old adage that, the most segregated day in America is Sunday morning, when various Christians in America go to different churches. This is no different. We could say the same thing. The most segregated day of the Muslim community is during our congregational day on Friday, when many of us go to our various masjids and Islamic centers in various parts of cities or towns, and they align by racial identity. That's not inherently a bad, but how do we also make sure that we do consistently engage amongst ourselves internally to our faith and externally to other people of faith and other conscious. And then last, collaborations with like-minded individuals and organizations to end widespread racial injustice, as well as anti-Black attitudes and behaviors unique to our own Muslim community. And last, practicing individual and community-wide prayer and self-reflection to eradicate the vestiges of racism and anti-Blackness from our souls. So very much our work is to address systemic challenges to racism, classism, sexism, and so forth. But as Muslims, as our definition of justice always starts first with purifying ourselves in our relationship to God, but understanding how that very much is also part of our relationship with our fellow humans, our families, our communities, and our roles and responsibilities to them. So SFJ for short, Stand for Justice, wants you to stand with us in our effort to seek to establish justice in an unjust world. A God-centric perspective on racial injustice in America, which is the topic of today's program, is the first of a series of programs we will be hosting on race and racism in America, inshallah, God willing, may it happen. This program intends to provide introductory information about the roots, mechanisms, and effects of systemic racism in this country. We're not talking about just individual racial prejudice. That does exist. But here, as we sharpen our understanding, speak more intelligently, be more strategic of how we address racism, we have to understand that it is a system that is embedded not just in human hearts, but in law, policy, programs, and it's institutionalized, regardless of whether an individual who may be white, who may benefit from it, knows that or not, consciously or unconsciously. Systems, we have to speak sophisticated in this way and understanding. And hopefully we'll learn today from people who've been in the lead on this type of understanding and within a faith paradigm. And so we are honored to have a panel of experts join us to share their knowledge with Muslim community members who want to fulfill their obligation to uphold justice, but may not know where to start. So we hope that this will be a beneficial program for you as you move forward. We want to take just one moment now to just bring a friend on. One of the sponsors of this event who's helped promote it, made possible bringing diverse speakers. I want to give a moment for our sister, Shifa Abbas, who is with Imam Mia Medics International, a wonderful organization that I've increasingly worked more with now through my advocacy work here in Washington, D.C. I'm an advocate lobbyist on humanitarian issues here in Washington, D.C. But Sister Shifa is the global coordinator for IMI, Imam Mia Medics International. She's a graduate of the Masters of Arts program in Religion, Culture, and Global Justice at Wilford Lawyer Lurie University, as well as a Master's of Education from Media College. She just returned from 6 months in Djibouti working on a USAID, U.S. Aid and Development, it's our the U.S. aid agency internationally, on a project as a gender equality officer. She has worked in education, nonprofit, and activism circles for the last 10 years. Sister Shifa, please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Shifa, and I'm here on behalf of Imamia Medics International, which is a UN-accredited international nonprofit and a medical body for Jafri health professionals. I wanted to welcome you all here to this event, and we wanted to thank Stand for Justice DMV for organizing this event, and as well as our honored speakers for taking the time to share their wisdom with us today. As organizations representing communities across America, we bear witness to the racial injustices facing Black communities every day. The killing of George Floyd on May 25th was only one instance in a long and painful history of oppression and police brutality faced by Black communities in the United States. We hope in the coming days, weeks, and years to use our platforms to support marginalized communities and actively call for an end to systemic discrimination built into the fabric of this country. So as a medical body, IMI stands for the elimination of disparity in healthcare based on racial, ethnic, or economic status. Yet our doctors are witness to systemic discrimination on a daily basis. Members of racial minorities are less likely to receive preventative healthcare, receive poor quality healthcare, experience worse health outcomes, and higher risks of chronic illness, infection, and disease. It is our duty not only as healthcare providers, but as Muslims and people of faith to denounce oppression and fight for justice for our Black brothers and sisters at this historic moment. We offer solidarity with those in the streets who continue to cry out for justice, equality, and reform throughout the country. And it's with this intention that we've published a statement of solidarity with Black communities across the country, signed by over 24 organizations. We've also written letters to local Black community organizations lending our support and solidarity, as well as key legislators, including the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, and multiple congressmen and congresswomen across the country. Alongside this, we've worked to create Urdu language videos to counter the stigma and prejudice alive in our communities against our Black communities. And IMI is taking concrete steps to further this mission of equal access and opportunity by establishing the Bilal Habashi George Floyd Scholarship, which will be allocated to a Black brother or sister and from a marginalized community on the basis of merit to go towards their education. And we know this is the smallest of first steps in a long road ahead to racial and social justice. And may Allah grant us with the tawfiq to help in this noble cause and the ability and willingness to see the errors in our ways and correct them, inshallah. Thank you so much.
Well, Jazakallah khair, Sister Shifa, and to all the team at IMI, and also those who support IMI with their donations and their monetary support and volunteering. And look, no doubt, I think many people know I work for Islamic Relief USA. I'm not here today on behalf of Islamic Relief, but as an organization that's increasingly working with IMI, especially through advocacy, people should be very proud of IMI, particularly as it comes out of our particularly Shia community. Please support them. They're responding in transcending ways, being a model for many other national level Muslim and particularly Shia organizations of how they can respond in a meaningful, aligned way that empowers, impacts, supports these communities. Please give to IMI. And just to also let you know, they've also been doing very important work. A lot of people think of them internationally, but they've also had an important role in responding to COVID. We can't forget about COVID. And because of the injustice that we see with the murder of Brother George and the response, the righteous rage that is people out in the streets, it's important that it's be done, but at the same time, that does have created disruptions for many communities who are already struggling with food security, hunger, access to markets, and so forth. So IMI has been doing important work with feeding and medical work. So please support them. And they've been a wonderful representative on the national level Muslim American COVID Task Force and been a leading voice in advocacy, lifting up these important issues. So thank you, Sister Shifa. It is very much the work that you're doing aligns also in anti-Black racism and racism. We got to have a comprehensive understanding of justice and racial justice. And what that means also is what is a just medical policy? What is a just housing policy? What is a just, criminal justice policy? What is a just food security, health policy? And how those we understand, the racial inequities based upon historically in these 4 or 5 key areas that everyone needs to have at least the foundations of a healthy, prosperous life. So we thank IMI for that, and it's very much aligned with the work and things we're talking about today. So we're going to move to our first speaker. So the first issue is really, let's get at it. It's the roots of racism. We got to understand, again, if it is a system, and if it is it's institutionalized, not just individual racial preference or prejudice, we have to talk about systemic racism, the roots of racism, and then how racism as a system, as an oppressive system, consistently reconfigures itself every generation. No doubt there are strides against injustice, changing in laws, or even some behavioral changes. But racism, it's the hydra where you cut off one head and another one pops up somewhere else. So today we have the privilege of having a real spiritual warrior, a long time, I'm using he's a vet that, certified. If you come from the city, he's certified in the struggle. But our good brother, Reverend Graylin Hagler, who he's born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and educated at that august institution, Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, the first of the HBCUs. Oberlin College, again, a trend-setting progressive college where the first African-Americans to receive graduate level education and masters and PhDs achieved those, over 150 years ago, nearly 150 years ago. And also a graduate of Chicago Theological Seminary. Reverend Hagler was involved in the Free South Africa movement, and likewise is involved in the fight for Palestine justice and rights. There have been a myriad of issues and causes that Reverend Hagler has embraced, and the general theme is freedom for the oppressed. So we're blessed to have Reverend Hagler talk again about the roots of racism and what that looks like, how they manifest today. Reverend, please.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's good to be here with everybody. And as I keep thinking about this theme, and particularly our God perspective on this theme, one of the things I have to sort of remind us is that there's always been a manifestation and a declaration of God that represents 2 spheres of influence. One has been that which protects the king. One has been that which protects the empire. One has been that which justifies colonial settler ideology. It is one that goes along with that and dresses God up as if God's in the real estate business and as if God is in the conquest business. And then there's the other perspective where we have always struggled for liberation, struggled to hold people accountable, struggled around issues of right and wrong, values, uplifting the oppressed, holding those who choose to try to oppress at bay. So there's always been this theological struggle in the world. I always remind folk in my religious tradition, I said, don't go running behind somebody because they call themselves reverend. Check out what they're about. Check out what they're talking about. Check out what their perspective is. Look at who they hang with, and therefore make a determination of whether that theology is something that you want to have lifted up, or that theology is something that needs to be denounced and people need to run away from. We very seldom do that kind of analysis. We, I know the language in the Christian church is, oh, he speaks the word. Well, the word that he speaks is the word that you want to have, that you want to hear, right? I mean, it's not that somebody's speaking the truth. It's basically we turn around and we try to make God in our own image. And therefore, you ever notice that God hates all the same people we hate, and God loves all the same people we love? That's the way we remake God. And so what I'm saying is we got to break beyond that worldview. Now, the issue is in this whole issue of racism, and I'm almost hesitant to call it racism anymore because it's a white supremacist ideology. Those of color, those immigrants, me, you, us, we have to struggle against an ideology that's built on a platform of control, exploitation, control of the environment, rip off of the resources where the rich get richer and the poor get poor. And that has been the struggle that we have almost dealt with all along. Now, what also happens is that you mix in there, particularly since 1492, you have a strong dose of pigmentation white supremacy. And what I'm saying, you have those who have sailed and basically so-called took over territories, being baptized by the God of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, and going forth, and from there attempting to wipe out native populations in South America, in the United States and Central America. And then when they had conquered the territory and had huge tracts of land, whether you're talking about the Caribbean or whether you're talking about South America, Central America, all of a sudden you needed a new commodity. And that new commodity was people to work your land that you were not going to pay because you couldn't afford to pay them. And so the whole thing got invented of this idea around enslaving folks. Enslaving folks always based upon pigmentation. The first attempts at enslaving folks were actually Native folks in the Americas. And Native folks basically in the Americas died being exposed from diseases and et cetera that Europeans brought to those Native lands. And therefore, massive amounts of slaves were brought into the New World, into the Caribbean, into North America, Central America, South America. You know, last August in the United States, there was the recognition of 400 years of the introduction of Africans into the British colonies. Now, notice I said it like that because you already had Spanish colonies in existence and you already had slaves on what is North America. And that was under basically the Spanish system. Now, one thing that's always interesting to me, and I think that we got to take some analysis of this, is that white supremacy is a structure that is created that basically says to a group of folks, you are supreme. Supreme in ideology, supreme in culture, supreme in history. In fact, there is no other history other than the history that you define and the narratives that you create. That's what we've been up against, and that's what we've been dealing with all along. And that narrative always basically demeans, denounces the other. And particularly if you mix pigmentation into it, that narrative always puts those who are of darker hue in a less position than those of a lighter hue. That's always a struggle. If you look around the world at the way racism or white supremacy manifests itself, you can be a person of color, but if you're lighter, somehow you're going to feel more superior to someone who is darker. Because that's the narrative that has been nurtured and presented forth into our consciousness, and we have become conditioned around that. And so we got to begin to understand this, that if you look at America, one thing that happens in America, United States, is that you have immigrant groups that come from Europe, immigrant groups that come from all over, and basically those immigrant groups out of Europe that may be discriminated against. Like I was in Boston for years, and the history in Boston was the Irish need not apply. The history in Boston was a bias against Italians. But then what happens is a generation later, because of the pigmentation, those groups assimilate into the dominant culture and become white. And therefore, they end up practicing the same kinds of white supremacist domination that the dominant culture has used against them a generation earlier. That is the nature of white supremacy. There's a quote that LBJ is cited with saying, is actually a historical quote. He says, if you can convince the dumbest white person that he is smarter than the smartest Black person, that white person will give you the money out of his pocket. He said, hell, he'll take it. You can take it all from him because that's the way it's set up. You know, it's just like, look at this stuff right now. Make America great again. From what? From 8 years of people of darker hue occupying a White House. And therefore, you could sell the bill of goods. We got to make America, because something was deficient. Something was wrong. Something was out of place. There was something that was incompetent. There was something that can't be believed. There's something that we need to take back and try to remove. You ever wonder why you hear words in your history, if you take history lessons, where they talk about the Renaissance? You ever ask yourself that question? The rebirth from what? Previous to that was what? The Dark Ages. And then you have the Renaissance. Rebirth from the Renaissance. Why? Because you're talking really about Moorish rule in Europe that is not recorded in any history book. And so you simply go and you use language that says, oh, rebirth. We're born again. Make America great again. It all fits together because it's part of the same mentality. I'm going to end on this because I had, when I graduated from seminary, there was a woman who thought of herself as sort of very progressive and liberal, and she came by my apartment because she knew I was checking out of my apartment. And she said, I think I might want to rent your apartment next year. Can I take a look at it? And I said, sure. And I let her in and she walked all through my apartment. Then she came back and she said to me, well, I think I can rent it because after all, I can fumigate it, right? Never realized what came out of her mouth. That the fact is that she was going to move in after a Black person meant that she needed to fumigate my apartment. That's what was sold to white America in 2016. Let's fumigate the country. Let's get the immigrants. Let's put the Black folks in their place. Let's continue to fight against Muslims. Let's continue to struggle against everything that we are afraid of, and really struggle against everything that we had conquered out of this fear that if we don't, they might do to us what we did to them. In other words, it's an acknowledgement of their own sin, their own historical sin. I heard that in reference to South Africa. I heard that in reference to the struggle that has taken place here in the United States of America for civil rights, human rights, because people know, those in power know the real history of the land and what we're faced with. And so I do gravitate away from racism because it's too light a term for me. It's white supremacy. Thank you.
Reverend, thank you. Thank you for bringing that. Before we brought everyone on, I said earlier when I was getting to know the good Reverend, I was like, I knew he was going to bring the hot fire on it, brought the history, the analysis of it. And it really, people listen. Look, the Reverend, he's speaking Malcolm. We all claim being Muslims that we love Malcolm. Malcolm taught us that we have to create our own language of liberation, that we can't use the oppressor's language, which will keep you confused. We see it, as he said, not saying that there's not racism or anti-Black racism, but this is the symptom. What is the cause? You got to ask yourself, and this is what he's telling you, how to realign how you think, turn it around. What is the cause of racism? It's white supremacy. You got to identify, you got to identify the problem itself. Otherwise, you're just swinging in the dark. And so I thank you, Reverend, for raising that. And we see this also in some ways in the Muslim community, again, around the issues of Black, even internally, anti-Black racism in the Muslim community. And, Brother Abid, Ayub from Detroit and so many places, the term Abd, for many of the Arab Americans who call Black and African people Abd, and they're not even aware, this means slave, right? But even in white history or controlled history, white supremacist history, and we learn it in schools, we so easily, Black slaves, or even Muslims, we say Bilal the slave, as if they're born, that's intrinsic to being Black is to be a slave. No, turn it around. Don't be contained by catechism of containment that control your mind. Enslaved person, he was an enslaved African, because when you say enslaved, then it puts the onus on, well, who's doing the enslaving? Same thing. It's not just anti-Black racism. What's causing it? It's white supremacy. Who benefits from that? So, Reverend, thank you for sharing that. And I think, again, if that's anything, you take anything away from what good Reverend was saying, this small little piece of information can change your way of understanding so many ways once you start developing a logic and language liberation, as our brother Malcolm said and taught us. So I want to move on to our next speaker. And I think the best way to really, the segue at this moment is to start talking about then, what is this, the racial milieu of the Muslim community? What does racism, and even how do people, and back to, the good Reverend, is white supremacy is not just internalized or benefited by white people. People of color internalize it. We don't recognize it. I'm constantly struggling to deal. How do I have been trained to think about my own self, my own family, or how I relate to my own Black brothers and sisters in my family, right? But so what does that look like as a family of believers, of diverse believers? As we said earlier, the Muslim community now is probably the most racially diverse religious group in the United States. So we're gonna have Sister Mona, Dr. Mona Massoud, who's gonna join in and talk about what does that look like, colorism, racism, and then also how that impacts not only just from larger white supremacy, but ourselves. How's that type of pressure, some of those type of marginalization impacts, again, people we call brothers and sisters in our deen, but through implicit biases and so forth, cause mental strain and stress and institutional oppression, even in our own Muslim institutions, unfortunately. But Sister, Dr. Massoud is an American board psychiatry and neurological certified general outpatient psychiatrist. That's a mouthful. Practicing in the greater Philadelphia area after completing her general adult psychiatry residency at Temple University Hospital, Go Owls, and the medical school at Edward Via Virginia College of Osteopathic Medicine. She's a board member of Muslim Wellness Foundation, an American nonprofit mental health awareness and education organization founded in Philadelphia by our good sister, Dr. Camila Rashad. If you have not been to the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, it is one of the best conferences in general. Don't get fooled just by the Black part. You need to be there. It's a great conference every year. So Dr. Massoud often leads community mental health education events and is most recently the founder and chief organizer of the Physician Support Line, a peer-to-peer support line run by over 700 psychiatrists to help physician colleagues navigate stress during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is our privilege, again, a veteran on this issue of racism and the psychological impacts on our community, and working with the great institution, Muslim Wellness Foundation. Dr. Mona, please share with us.
Jazakallah khairan, everyone, for hosting me today on this very important topic. Reverend Hagler, thank you so much for your words. Something that has stuck for me from what you just said, and will hopefully segue into the next part of this, is that we have to find the words, we have to redefine things, we have to reframe what has been taught to us. We have to take back our narratives on who we are and who we want to be in terms of a community and in terms of an ummah in the Muslim community. And we have to often remember in that process of reframing and redefining words that history is often written by the eyes of the people in power. And it does not, so the perspectives that we are given are often one that is inherent to maintaining power, and it is to perpetuate power. So keeping that in mind and going along with the what we were discussing of historic racism in America, I want to talk about kind of racism as it happens and what to do about it in our Muslim community. So roughly, and these stats may be off a bit, but roughly about 20% of American Muslims are African American. And that is African American, I mean like Black American, not immigrant African community. And then we have the rest made up of primarily what we see as immigrant Muslims. And my family is South Asian. We are from the Indian subcontinent. And there is a lot of rewriting of history we ourselves have to do in all of this. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what has caused us to come to this point where we are complicit in anti-Black racism within our communities. And I want to take you kind of back to, and I can only speak, I guess, from the South Asian background, but I think a lot of other immigrant Muslim populations can relate to this as well, because there has been colonization in other countries as well. So basically, I mean, before colonization in India, we've had, you know, the Mughal Empire, which was a Persian, mainly a Persian Turkish empire. So we did have Muslim rulers at one point in India. And, you know, and prior to that, there was obviously caste systems that also were there from the Hindu majority, and also were delineated by pigmentation of skin. Mainly due to who is working the fields, who is, you know, able to be at home and be spared the glaring sun, etc. And then we had the Persian Empire come again of a different pigmentation. And that also got stratified over time of the ones who were purely from a particular race, those who were converts within the Hindus, and those who were mixed, and so forth, so on. These kind of things were already pre-existing, and then colonization happened. And with colonization, maybe this is getting a bit into it, but with colonization, our colonizers were not of the same faith as the people that they were colonizing. And in that, what was utilized often in European colonization of these areas was known as the Hamitic myth, being that, you know, Ham and Reverend, please correct me if this is incorrect. Ham as being someone who had disobeyed and gone against Noah was punished with, you know, his dark skin, and punished as a way of maybe delineating that, you know, there's an inferiority between him and God's chosen prophet. That being said, the Hamitic myth was to explain the observed phenotypic differences between the colonizer and the colonized during that time, in order to allow some morality in the terms of the imperialism that was going on during the time. And so when we were colonized, there were several attempts to kind of, you know, maintain the power structure. And since there was so much language and religion barrier between our colonizers and the colonized, it soon became about how do we get them to, you know, see us as the ones in charge. And it became an education. So education changes, and then the language changes. And then all of a sudden you're not speaking your language and your tongue anymore. And these are similar to what has happened with enslavement as well in the United States. But over in India, then you would have that they're all speaking English. They don't have the terms to speak to each other about their own lived experiences. It becomes the lived experience of the one who's teaching them their language. Then you have that the education system changes. Then you have that certain, you know, rewards and punishments are doled out according to the person, you know, acceptance of their colonized mindset. And the ones who rebel are seen as less, and so forth. And so we have all of that cultural baggage, which eventually did lead us to becoming more or less, you know, independent of the British colony. But that was in the 1940s. And 1940s, thanks, Jihad. And so 1940s is about the same time that, you know, not only are we gaining our independence, we're a new nation, but we're also thinking about immigrating outside of our nation. And then why did America enter into our framework of being a place to immigrate to? And honestly, it was not out of some, you know, vast search or need of us as people, but as a setup for something called the model minority. Because what else was happening in America during the same time of mass immigration from Muslim countries, such as my parents, was the civil rights movement. And so when the civil rights movement is happening and we're seeing protests and we're seeing righteous anger and we're seeing brutality and all of that, we need and America needs another narrative. They need to show that people who are not white can live under the white rule and function as model minorities. And so we are here, and then we come here, and we are allowed to have rights and privileges that our Black brothers and sisters are not allowed. Who is calling the shots? It is in the end, the people in power who allowed us to move forward and get the jobs that we associate with model minorities, or the education or the position in society as we associate with the concept of a model minority. It is the fact that we were used and as at times also complicit in writing this narrative of having of climbing on the backs of the labor and the work of the Black community in order to be elevated in the eyes of white supremacy. So, and then we are now in this lived experience where we have convinced ourselves that we pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps, that we deserve to be here, that we deserve the outcomes because I wanted this, my parents worked hard, they moved from another country, all these rationalizations that we tell ourselves to why we deserve to be in the positions and the jobs and the safety and the strata that we are now are just that, rationalizations that were meant to happen in order to create a divide and conquer strategy within the community that we live in, so that we can continue oppressing the people that were rising up, who were using their voices, who were fighting for justice. Because giving a few a little bit and acceptance and elevation was a lot easier and made economic more sense than to right the wrongs of so many years of inequality for the vast majority of Black Americans. So we are complicit in this situation. And I ask that our brothers and sisters that relate to the immigrant story of coming to America know that we have to do our own research and our own history in what makes us us. Why are we here? What are we doing? And it is easy to live our lives kind of just going on and convincing ourselves of our importance and our worth. But to think of the real reasons behind it is the next step that will allow us to change the narrative. Thank you so much.
Dr. Mona, thank you for sharing that with us, giving us an overview of understanding the complexities. Again, we shouldn't think that racism, anti-Black racism, is just a common knowledge, common sense understanding. A lot of people fool themselves to think, oh, yeah, I know racism. No, there's histories, there's institutions, and how does race come into play coming from colonial past as people move to the United States? And we need to recognize this. I just on the technical side, I want everyone to please, if you are having any difficulties with the volume or the sound, you can try refreshing. That could help, whether you're on the Facebook page or so. There was some slight glitches early on. We hope the sound is clear now. But it's thinking about the statements by Reverend Hagler and Dr. Mona, and thinking about just the context. Again, this is state oppression of and murder of Black people, systemic racism, hunger and poverty. These are nothing new. But as many of us, again, many people, community struggling during COVID, those who are not like me, who are able to work at home and still make a living, but people who are at home because there is no longer a job for them. People who are struggling for the past 12 weeks, many concerned about where their next meal is going to come from. Are they going to be able to keep the lights on? Their child is unable to learn because they don't have a computer into their home. Or, they may, like a lot of people, only have a smartphone, but 3 children. How are they going to learn off one smartphone? So when we think of these conditions and what people face, and I don't know the full condition. We know that Brother George has a daughter that he loved and was striving to take care of. But don't tell me about he got called in. It was because of a fake $20 bill. So what? When millions of Americans right now are all facing and concerned about where their next meal is going to come from, their next bag of groceries, you're going to kill someone over a fake $20 bill We don't even know if that's true. So we see that particularly in the Muslim community, and particularly in places like, if you've ever been to Lake Street in Minnesota, that is a community. It cuts right through largely a Latino community in some parts and a Somali community. And if you were watching from distance, you saw the Somali community were out there in arms along with their Black brothers, American brothers and sisters, and other people of, socially conscious communities. Because again, they come to America, they themselves are victims of anti-Black racism. They responded in kind. And we know the Somali community is almost 99% Muslim. And we had even Muslims coming out from the suburbs, from the South Asian and Desi community. Not saying all, but what I want to say, I am hopeful out of this situation, this unjust situation, is for many youth in our community. And Reverend knows better than me, the old biblical saying, and a child shall lead them. It is the youth. It is the young people in our communities. Unfortunately, many times they may not learn the language of liberation in our masjids from some of our alims, or giving the tools of community organizing, but they're learning them on their college campuses, working with organizations like Amnesty International, or pairing up with the Black Student Association, going out and doing community service, or they're working now at social justice organizations. And we want our youth to do that. But what is our role to give them also a grounding of understanding from the Quran, the traditions, the paradigms of the Ahl Bayt? These are all important. So this is, again, Muslims have been up in arms in righteous rage and responding. But in particularly, again, if there is a hope for our community to overcome these racial divides and also a generational divide, it is the youth that are leading it. And we need to invest in them. I said somewhere a couple weeks ago that I failed the youth. I admit it. And I could do more with my resources and what I have in DC. And I think we're all committed to doing that, we're all not getting any younger. We need to start investing and start passing that perennial baton over to the next generation. Let's move forward to our next speaker. Actually, a good friend of mine. It was my pleasure of actually working with him to bring him on to this program. We want to talk about now moving transition. We've had the background, kind of a history and what racism manifests in America and how it also looks in the Muslim community and how that impacts our communities. But what does it look like? Again, what are our youth are doing? Who are they learning from? Maybe not always from the minbar, not always. There's a lot of our good sheikhs are taking on this issue, but how they're finding leadership in Muslim and even secular organizations or ethnic related organizations around civil rights, human rights, humanitarian work. And because of that type of understanding, we wanted to bring one of the best that has to offer in our community, particularly coming from that bastion of the Muslim community in Dearborn, part of the larger Detroit community. It's our brother Abid Ayub. My brother, he defines advocate, has demonstrated track record of being an ally, and not just an ally, but also being in solidarity. If you understand, there is a slight difference. We can talk about that. What does being an ally and what does being solidarity really mean? And maybe I can discuss that. But Abid Ayub served as the National Legal and Policy Director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, otherwise made known as ADC, the country's largest Arab American civil rights organization. Throughout his career, Abid has worked to address issues impacting Arabs and Muslims in the United States, including matters related to discrimination, immigration, hate crimes, surveillance, and profiling. Under his leadership at the ADC legal department, he has successfully assisted and provided support to thousands, and really thousands. I've been people who've sent him to Abid for help in past years, and many of us in this call have. But thousands of who have been impacted by, community members who've been impacted. Abid regularly advocates on behalf of the community with lawmakers and government agencies, and also works to enhance the community's economic empowerment and access to education. And I just want to say that as been a leader at ADC for the past 12 years here in DC, he's been working with them since he was in Dearborn as a young man and going through law school. But even then, I've seen Abid, how he has forged ties with the ADC, working with organizations, august organizations like the NAACP and ACLU and so forth. And even in many years, people may not know, a lot of people know Ben Jealous, the previous head of the NAACP, one of that young generation of leadership, to come and be the keynote speaker at the ADC convention. It was a wonderful time to see that, bringing the Arab American community and the Black community around social justice, civil rights, and civil liberties. So Abid is well-versed in this type of work of being an ally and what that means. And so we hope we can maybe share some key points as many on this call are thinking about what they can do, how they need to align their work, who should they be engaging with over, in the coming years. So if you can take 10 to 12 minutes to share some of that, we would definitely will benefit. Brother Abid.
Thank you, Jihad. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Reverend Hagler and Dr. Munna, for your words. And I do want to say we have had Reverend Hagler at ADC at our conference as well. And I'm inspired. I mean, this is a great conversation. I just want to touch on a few points that weren't in my notes that I think are important to discuss. And one, during this time, and when we're talking about the system and we're talking about laws and what's happening with the police violence and what's happening, oftentimes we hear that the system is broken. The system is broken. But I want to remind people the system isn't broken. The system is working precisely and exactly as the framers and the founding fathers of this country intended it to. When that document was written, Article 1, Section 2 said a Black man is 3/5 of a person. So in Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, and I'm losing track of all the documents now because I'm so energized, they consolidated their power. We're going to have a House, we're going to have a Senate, and then, gets into like 25 years old to run, and you got to be a citizen. And then the next line was a Black man is a 3/5 of a person. How are you going to build a system where that's the very first thing that they said? That's the first thing the framers put in there. It was so important to them that it didn't wait till Article 4 or 5. It had to be on top. It had to be there. So that's the poisonous, that's a poisonous document. That's a poisonous system. From there, anything that followed is bad. So the system is working precisely and is exactly as the framers of this country intended it to. And we are up against an enormity of challenges. And unfortunately, we are in a position where you have two choices, either fortunate or unfortunate, depending how you look at it. You have two choices. One is engagement, and working with a lot of these politicians and parties and getting pulled into that system and, becoming either a Democrat or a Republican. We're not affiliated with any party, at least myself. And I'm not speaking on behalf of ADC in this column, in my own personal capacity. I'm not affiliated with any party. Both the Republicans and the Democrats have been just as bad for the civil rights and human rights and Black communities in this country from the start of its inception. So we have to understand, and I'm speaking here from a non-Black minority group, and I'm speaking here to fellow Arabs and brown people, is look, we have a role as a community in this, in moving forward, and we have to understand the struggles the Black community is going through precisely in this time. And the one thing I tell people, the first thing you can do to be a good advocate and the first thing you can do to learn about the issues is listen. Listen to what they're saying. But what I always tell people is also listen with your eyes. Listen with your eyes and watch what's happening. Watch what's happening in the streets. Watch what's happening with these movements, and pay attention and try to incorporate that into what your asks are, into what your advocacy is. Go back to the communities, go back to the ground, whether it be in Dearborn or in Ohio and Florida, and connect with the Black community out there to figure out how we can come up with a universal agenda for all of us. Because Black rights, Arab rights, human rights, they're going to be for all of us. None of us on this call are going to benefit completely from the way this system is set up. That's just the reality. As was said earlier, our pigmentation just doesn't line up. Some have it worse, and we got to be understanding of this. We got to realize this as Muslims, as humans, and all Americans need to understand this, right? So we need to push through this and push through justice. One of my favorite quotes from Imam Ali alayhi salam is, nothing can cause nations to flourish like justice. How do we achieve that justice in this country? How do we push and pull with our politicians? We have elections coming up. It's not the greatest of systems. We're not head over heels over the Democratic Party. The Republican Party wants to, get us out of here as quick as they could. So what do? It's important to pay attention to a lot of the local races that's happening. And I'll point to Minnesota as an example, where we have one of our own brothers, we have as Attorney General, Keith Ellison. This is not a national position. This is a state position. But you have Keith Ellisons, you have attorney generals and district attorneys running across the country. With good district attorneys in your cities, you can bring more charges. You can change the way policing happens. You can change the way things are implemented and crime is addressed. So it's important to work with our communities, work with our partners to figure out how we can address these. And don't speak on behalf of the Black community. Don't go in there when you're meeting with these candidates, think, you have the agenda or this is what you're going to push through. I can't stress enough, important to talk to them, get an understanding of these issues. But the biggest issue, the biggest problem we're going to face moving forward is, what role do we as Muslims, do we as minority communities play in this two-party government system? And that's a difficult question to answer on this call or on this webinar, right? I can say, get engaged, work with the campaigns, volunteer, and a lot of people will agree. But we're going to have a lot of people in the community say, why should I do that? They've been just as complicit as the others. They've been just as guilty as the others. But as I said, there's a reality. The reality is, if Trump gets another term, most likely the Supreme Court is gone. And then our challenges have become even larger. Because as an attorney, I can tell you the 5-4 decisions are going to become 7-2 decisions, 6-3 decisions. And you could forget about any rights that we have left on a federal level are gone. That's the reality we have. And even though we're not, excited over the Democratic nominee, even though we're not head over heels on him, or we may think there's another option, another third-party option we can go to, we have to understand that the importance our community plays in addressing these. And we have to be at the table on a universal agenda, a universal human rights agenda for this country, and how we can pursue that. I don't have all the answers. But I do know that by working together as communities, by making ourselves better, and again, I'm speaking this to the non-Black communities out here, make yourself better, understand the other community, get rid of the racism in the community, listen to what Dr. Munna has to say, listen to how, this model minority myth that we're a lot of us are buying into, how we can make ourselves better. We can't push our communities forward until we push ourselves forward. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. The issues are real. We know them. We know the difference in the stark contrast now between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I would hope that we take an opportunity on the ground, whether it be in our mosques or in our churches, to meet with our different communities out there, learn from them, and come up with an agenda. Pay attention, most importantly, pay attention to the local races. Pay attention to these judges' races, these DA races, local legislatures. And are we going to fix things overnight? No. Are we going to fix things through voting? A little bit we may. But are we going to fix things, by continuing to take to the streets, by continuing to have our voices heard? Absolutely. And that you don't substitute one for the other. Just because you're going to vote doesn't mean you can't go out there and have your voice heard. You can do both. And I know there's going to be some that will debate with me back and forth saying it's not worthy. But again, please pay attention to the realities that we have and the role we can play in addressing this and helping the community move forward, even if it's incremental at this time. Thank you.
Brother Abid, I want to thank you for sharing that. Again, we're not going to cover all. Look, someone said to me, well, we got to trust the good intentions of our Muslim brothers in figuring it out and solving racism. Well, if it was all about just good intentions and being good Muslims, that meant racism would have been solved 1400 years ago, day one, from the prophet receiving revelation. No, it reconfigures. It is a system that we have to constantly be, keep the lookout on and pressing and working and taking it seriously. But I will say this one thing: if you're a young person on this webinar, or if you're a parent with a child or a young adult in your home who's going to college, I will say this: what you need to do is you need to start interning. You need to spend your time in your college years or right after you graduate, come to DC. Intern, apply to be an intern, especially if you want to go to law school, intern at ADC, work with Abid IU. Or if you can't get at ADC, go to the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, or ACLU, or Capitol Hill, or do an internship at, at Human Rights Watch, whatever it is, and then call Abed up and get coffee with him once or twice during that summer. Call me up. I'll talk about what I'm doing on Capitol Hill. We need more Muslims and we need more Shia doing these type of opportunities while you can, webbing both your school learning and your practical knowledge learning through internships, fellowships in public policy, advocacy, community organizing, and so forth. Let's let 1,000 flowers bloom every summer with young Muslims and young Shia coming to DC, interning on Capitol Hill, at ADC, at Islamic Relief, and so forth. If you need, we'll do another follow-up webinar on that to help you to understand that, especially if you're a rising junior and a rising senior, or those months. And call Dr. Mona and call Muslim Wellness Foundation and the Black Muslim Psychology Conference. They have a wonderful fellowship program, particularly for Black and African youth who want to learn about psychology and mental health, and helps put on the conference. Participate in those programs. So, they're made available. That's part of the process of gaining the tools, the resources, the networks, and the knowledges that you need as a young leader. Again, I failed you, and I'm trying to make up for it. Call me. Let me know how I can be of help to you. So we're going to finish off, at least with the core of our program. And also, as we're getting to our last formal speaker, if you have questions or formulating ideas, please utilize the Slido, slido.com website, event number 37891. Submit your questions there. We have a team who will be looking at your questions, and we'll submit them for the last 20 minutes as we're getting close to that time. Please, if you do have questions, submit them through that format. But our last formal speaker is a brother I've had the blessings to know for over a decade. And he is really what our community deserves. Actually, we have two sheikhs on. We have a special guest at the end too. But two of the premier, most learned, and from our community, born and raised here, who've sacrificed their time and their development, spending many years, decades, learning classically jurisprudence, fiqh, understanding of our deen, traveling around the world, but coming back now and really reestablishing roots, being resources to the Muslim community, applying their classical learning to the day-to-day trials and tribulations of being a Muslim American and just being a human in America. These people are speaking just to Muslims, they're speaking to diverse communities, and it's for our benefit. They're taking on the mantle, passing the baton from Reverend Hagler even to the Muslim community. So who I'm speaking about is our good brother, Sheikh Jafar Muhibullah from IBA, the Shia Majority Center down in the great city of Houston, that little blue dot in the middle of the state of Texas, in a sea of red, or maybe now turning purple, we'll see. But Sheikh Jafar has spent over 20 years studying Islam in Medina, New York, and Qom, Iran. He writes and speaks on a wide range of relevant and important topics representing the Muslim voice. And Sheikh Muhibullah holds a MA in Islamic Studies from Duke University, and he's participated in advanced studies in Islamic jurisprudence from Darul Kharij in Qom, Iran, and completed research towards a PhD program. He studies Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. Man, even Urdu? Oh, brother, polyglot. Urdu literature, discourse analysis, Islamic philosophy, law, and theology. He's currently the resident scholar of the Islamic Ahl Bayt Association, IBA, in Austin, Texas, and also serves as a board member of Interfaith Action of Central Texas, IACT. And increasingly, I know as we go through and respond to this, many of you are seeing him more present on webinars, and rightfully so, as he's come back to us for, again, many years of studying. The Sheikh is going to give us a foundation of, again, what is the spiritual jihad? What is the spiritual aspects of social justice as we, in turn, ourselves and as a collective body, purify ourselves in worship of Allah, but with a God conscious, a taqwa, and a tawheed focus around social justice and focus on social justice. So Sheikh Jafar, please share with us those foundations, those maqasid, those foundations of our deen that are most relevant to this moment in time as we try to be spiritual social justice warriors.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Jihad. Also, I'd like to thank the other panelists. Thank you, Abid, Mona, and Reverend Hagler for your presentation. As I'm coming on, I was asked to give some references as well, some things that folks can do to follow up on this. So before I give something that folks can read with regards to the topic I'm giving, I definitely want to point people in a direction that they can read a little bit more about what Reverend Hagley, he stated, and also what the Mona, she stated. There's a book by the name of We Are All Moors. And I'm sure that a lot of folks, they may not understand that some of the history that Reverend Hagley gave is very, very deep, very in detail. So if you read this book, We Are All Moors by Anwar Majid, he kind of outlines also what Reverend Hagley was talking about, the experiment that the Spanish did in colonizing the South Americans and so forth, so on, the natives of this land, and how that also plays out even today as this white supremacy ideology is at the forefront. Another book I want to point everyone to, there's a book by the name of The Everyday Language of White Racism by Jane Hill. This also talks about how white supremacy, or this white supremacy ideology, is steeped in the culture of America. And I think Abid, he hit the nail on the head as well, to show how it is systematically embedded within the system. I'll give you one example, and this is a very interesting example because a lot of us, we may come across this. It's not mentioned in Jane Hill's book, but nonetheless, it was in a PhD dissertation that I read. It's about the word ain't. And you might find a lot of Black folks, things like that, they'll use the word ain't. The ironic history about this is that it was a word that was created by a lot of aristocratic white folks, and they would use it among themselves. And then when their Black servants, they picked up on it and they began to use it. They completely eradicated this word from their vocabulary, and then they began to create this negative kind of understanding that, oh, whoever uses this word ain't, they don't know English properly. So even today, if you hear someone who says ain't, it's not because, you know, that they're making this word up and it is come from a lack of English. It actually came from the white folks. And when the Black folks adopted it, they got rid of it and turned the tables. So a very interesting history there. But nonetheless, what I want to do when I'm grounding you guys in this understanding, the spiritual understanding of racism and what we can do. My last reference is a book that most of the Muslims are familiar with, but perhaps they have not studied it deeply, or deep enough to understand what their Imam is talking about, Imam Ali. So the Nahj al-Balagha. So if you open this book, Nahj al-Balagha, to Sermon 192, in Arabic they call it the Sermon of Al-Qasiyah. And in the sermon, Imam Ali, he addresses the idea and the concept of al-Asabiyya. Now, Asabiyya, it is perfectly in line with my dear brother, Shaheed Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, he stated. It is all those negative isms. If you know, Asabiyya encompasses all of that. Imperialism, colonialism, racism, tribalism, nationalism, any negative ism that you can think of, even that very interesting ism that Brother Malcolm, Shaheed Malcolm, he mentioned, and that is dollarism. That when the almighty dollar comes forth and you get caught up into the dollarism, then with regards to justice, people are silent because they're afraid to lose their status. They're afraid to speak out against injustice. That injustice that exists everywhere. So what is that? You could say the spiritual connection or the spiritual illness that is associated with racism or all these other negative isms or those ideologies or those things which brings us or maybe sometimes subconsciously ties us to this ideology of white supremacy. Imam Ali in Sermon 192, he speaks about that event that we also know about in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he asked Adam, or where he asked the angels to bow to Adam. And so everyone bowed except for Satan. And why didn't Satan bow? Satan said that, you know, you made me of smokeless fire and you made this man out of clay. And in fact, when we read the Quran, it is a dark clay. You got the hue going on is there as well. So he refused to bow. And because he refused to bow, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cast him out of the realm of the angels. Imam Ali, with this, he says that Iblis, he displayed the quality of asabiya, of this racism, or all those negative isms. And at the root of that al-asabiya was takabbur, pride. So he prided himself and what he believed was a quality better than Adam. And if we go to the root of racism or even imperialism, colonialism, all these type of things, you have this mindset of folks looking at what they have, not realizing that, well, if you've been given fluency, you've been given a wealth or abundance, then this is a blessing from God. And it is a test from God. But instead of understanding this, what happens is that they take it as pride, and they take it as a mark that, well, I am better than this person. They take their color for those individuals who simply look at color, and as Reverend Hagley said, it is actually more than just color. A few people are stuck on the color, but they take that and they give themselves a mark above others. They say, well, because I'm this color, that I'm better than those folks. Because I have this position, that I'm better than those folks. And the cure to that, as Imam Ali, he states, he says, arm yourself with humbleness. And only if you arm yourself with humbleness before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you're able to begin to cure this. And why should we humble ourselves, or how exactly should we humble ourselves? I mentioned this in one of our other webinars that we had. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he states in Surah Al-Rum, he states that he has created this heavens and the earth, and he has created you, meaning mankind, with different colors and with different languages. And he says this is one of his signs. In other words, it's a sign of God's greatness. But when we don't humble ourselves to understand that and to see that, we become arrogant and think, well, my color is better than that color. Or at times we may think that, and this is the thing where we talk about, white supremacy ideology. Why is it more than simply color? Because you have folks, as Shaheed Malcolm, he also stated, very beautifully, he stated that, who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught you to hate your color and the texture of your hair, the way you look? Who taught you to hate the broadness of your nose? Again, the white supremacy ideology. And people who have bought into that white supremacy ideology, whether through slavery, whether through imperialism, whether through colonialism. And you see that, as Malcolm also said, that, people begin to try to, they begin to whitewash their skin. They begin to dye their skin. They want to become lighter, So that doesn't only happen in Africa. You find it in the subcontinent, in, India and Pakistan. You find it all over these places. Why? Because their standard of what seems to be good is white. The lighter I am, the better I am. when this is actually a superficial standard of goodness and greatness, of righteousness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he actually puts the standard of what is greatness? What makes a person better than another person? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he states, he says that he's created you from male and female. He's created you different tribes and different nations. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Only those individuals who are more conscious of God is better. And being conscious of God, that means that you will understand all of the variety that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in this earth, from our different colors, from our different languages, from our again, different genders, male, female, from the variety of fruits and blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. We understand the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we understand the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we appreciate those differences. We embrace those differences. And only by doing that, as Imam Ali also he says, and this is a sermon that I believe the community should read, should sit down and study, because again, you want a spiritual path to rooting out racism or rooting out this white supremacy ideology, then it lies in Sermon 192. And truly understanding that spiritual illness there. Likewise, you couple it with the other two books that I mentioned, the We Are All Moors, so that you'll understand some historical foundation of white supremacy, and also the everyday language of white racism, so that you will understand even kind of the very subtle language and the very subtle culture of racism and white supremacy. And this is why I think it's a very grave disservice to folks of color in this country, especially those who have African roots. And this is why when Reverend Hagler, when he mentioned about the Moors, it put a very big smile on my face, because not a lot of people understand that when the slave trade, when it began, the whole of West Africa was part of the Maghreb. It was part of the Western Muslim Empire. It was the Maghreb. And this is why the Africans who came here, they're rightfully, or at least if you want to understand who they are truly, then they should be called the Moors. Simply giving their name as, oh, these are Black people. This is a language of racism. It's a language of white supremacy. Unfortunately, a lot of the Black folks themselves have bought into this, but we've been taught, at least this is what we're, part of the ideology of white supremacy is to remove the cultural and the heritage of Black folks who have been brought over here. So you say, oh, well, they're Black or they're African American. Most white people, if you ask them, again, white, they're pitting white against Black. But if you ask those individuals who check white on the census, oh, well, where's your heritage? They'll tell you, oh, well, at least the Muslims who are part of the Moors, oh, we are Iranian because they check white. Oh, we're Arab because they check white as well. Of course, this is a part of history that you probably should know as well, that the Asians, they don't check white. Those who are from South Asia, those who are from India, Pakistan, why don't they check white? Well, the history of that is in 1907, President Roosevelt, he banned people from the subcontinent from becoming citizens. And why did he ban them from becoming citizens of America? He says, well, they're not white. He says, we can't classify them as white people. Only in 1964, when President Truman, he became president, he says, okay, we allow them now to become citizens. Just as Dr. Muna said, now they're becoming the model minority. What's happening in 1946? The partition between India and Pakistan. So, oh, well, let's bring this model minority here, and the Moors, who you call the Black folks, they were rising up and they were galvanizing themselves to advocate for their rights. And so now we have this model minority coming in. So all those folks who are saying that they are white or claiming white, they need to understand that history, that The west of Africa was part of the Maghreb. It was the furthest western part of the Muslim empire. We are rightfully Moors. And if you ask all these white folks who are collecting white, this is my point, they'll tell you, oh, well, we're from Iran, or we're from Lebanon or Iraq. They can tell you that. You ask any white person who is European white, they'll tell you, oh, well, my lineage, we are Irish, we're Russian, we're Dutch, we are Italian. But you actually average Moor or so-called Black person, okay, well, where are you from? Well, I'm Black, I'm American, African American. They have no understanding of where their lineage go back to. And this was by design. It was a plan in order to, again, to have white supremacy prevail, not simply in the culture, but also in the minds of those individuals who they are trying to oppress and suppress, and have been doing so even up until today. And the example of it is the brutal murder of George Floyd. So as we are moving forward within our own community, our own Muslim community, to root out racism, to root out all of these negative isms that is part of the white supremacy ideology, we need to understand the history. We need to understand the language and the cultural, the very subtle cultural elements of that racism, colonialism, or whatever is there. And then also the spiritual side, how we need to, again, root out this kind of pride that we may have that is based on something that's very superficial, something that's mundane and material. Color of my skin, the type of car I drive, the wealth that I've supposedly earned. And we take that towards a more God-conscious understanding of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us. If He's blessed us with this variety of color, then I can look at those colors and I say, wow, subhanAllah, glory be to God that God, He created all of this. I can look towards, again, my social status, my economic status, and I can say, oh, subhanAllah, alhamdulillah, praise be to God, He has blessed me with this, but all more to help others who may not be as fortunate as I am. So that's how we have to root out this racism or this white supremacy ideology from ourselves and move towards a more God-conscious interaction and relationship with one another. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Oh, walaikum salam. Sheikh Jafar, thank you so much for that. And it was worth a couple of minutes, going a little bit over, for giving that foundation. Really, ultimately, let's do it in the positive sense of how do we strive, again, through our studying and our understanding of our faith and learning from Nahj Balagha. And for many of us in the school of Ahl Bayt, understanding that this is only second to the Quran. There's, the many important texts in Islamic studies, but the teachings and the sermons of our Imam, the first scientist of Islam, the first master of the Arabic, grammar. That's why it is the peak of eloquence that we should ponder over his teachings 1,400 years later. And particularly, as you said, how do we move towards a tawhidic ideology and belief and faith grounded on tawheed, the oneness of God, and what that means also as humanity. And it's so important. Thank you for that. As we respond to the flip side is, shaitani systems that they're all rooted in arrogance and pride. This is what they are. They're all lead back to these issues of shaitan, or the devil, and how we root them out. Well, we're going to transition now to some Q&A. Again, I want to thank everyone for sharing their comments. We have 3 questions already coming in. We're going to put them forward, spend about 10 minutes or so on a couple of questions as we head towards the end of the program. Let's jump right into it. First question, a very practical one, addressed to Dr. Mona. How do you respond to people in our community who say, this is from the person sharing the question, who say that Black people have problems because they are violent criminals? People who basically are susceptible to the stereotypes that we see through media and so forth. How do you respond to those who in our community of other racial, ethnic, class status, who blame the victim, as we would say now, whether those actual real statistically are Black people really actually, are they more criminal than other folks? Statistics don't show that actually. But yeah, how do we respond to that?
So what is the psychology behind the model minority myth? Is a psychological acceptance that how you are described or how you are viewed by the majority, which is in our case in America, the white majority, is then also means that you have to embody and you have to internalize their viewpoints. It is there's a psychological concept that is called identifying with the aggressor. And it is a kind of a survival mechanism that ends up happening. Colloquially, just in a common way we talk about it is like, the abused becoming the abuser. And oftentimes what happens in either, whether we want to call it the colonized mindset or the fact that you are being given some sort of reward when you are, when you are accommodating the person in power's views, and you are being given status, you're given wealth, you're given education, you're given all of these things, then you take on those views. Because instead of having that kind of, wait a minute, what is going on? And am I being used? Am I being a puppet? Instead of having that kind of thought process, you're just kind of giving in to the person in power's views. And so this is a very common trope that was used even when my parents' generation immigrated to the United States. I was born and raised in the States, but when my parents immigrated over here, there was already all of these things that have happened. The civil rights movement, as I was saying before, was already either full swing or already had occurred, and the immigrant community was honestly benefiting greatly without acknowledging the work of our African American brothers and sisters. And we were benefiting it because, again, we were set up as a rival to them on purpose in order to continue the narrative which includes the concept that they are this, they are lazy, they are this, they are unable family dynamics, they are not able to do this, or whatever other ideas we often hear as tropes. And subscribing to that trope was easy because it allowed us to continue elevating. And if you're going to giving up privilege is hard. And it's hard only because of ego. And that is what we were just hearing from before. It's hard to face the fact that you may have been complicit in someone else's suffering. And but doing that work is actually liberating. When you realize that you've been played, you are free. Just like what actually happened overseas. When we realize we're being played and being utilized for a purpose that is diminishing our worth in the end, then you are truly free. So I would ask ourselves, what I would tell that person who had that question, as well as anybody else, where am I getting this knowledge from? Who told me that? And then start there. If that knowledge is not coming from an actual interaction, an actual data, evidence-based, data, then where am I getting this information? And then why am I perpetuating this information if I don't know where it came from?
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Mona. And even harking back to the last few comments of Sheikh Jaffer, and even harking back to Reverend Hagler, just the issue of, again, even as racism, internalized white racism is even within Black and brown people. And sometimes if there's not even a manifestation or understanding of the history of even Islam amongst African people, the foundation. Now slavery was a doozy, to say the least, on historical breaks of knowledge transmissions and so forth. But we understanding that there is long historic traditions, center of learning in Africa, particularly West Africa, where most Black Americans, descendants of African slaves or enslaved Africans come from. It's just understanding what is that history like. And I say that because I think sometimes even then, many Muslims, and particularly Black Muslims, Sunni, Shia, so forth, we're even dependent upon our notion of learning from communities on certain parts of the Muslim world that may have rampant racism in there. And how does that itself, impact the way we learn about what Islam is, or even the people we look for leadership, the unfortunate sicknesses that may be in their own heart towards communities who are learning from them. But how do we learn about West Africa? And I just want to real quick, recommend 2 books for people, Black, South Asian, Arab, even non-Muslims, to learn about 2 ways of looking at it. The rich tradition of Islam in West Africa, the pious learning communities, and one of them being from our good brother, Rudolph Ware. People know him as Brother Bilal Ware, but Rudolph Ware, professor at UC Santa Barbara, but his book, The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and the History in West Africa, talking about 1,000 years of Islamic tradition, where even Arabs and so forth would travel across North Africa to West Africa to get to learn from key sheikhs and alims and scholars, and from the Muslim brotherhoods, the Tariqas, the Sufic orders, and how a lot of that learning still, in another book, Servants of Allah. Most people probably have seen this. It's been around for 15 years. Servants of Allah by our sister Sylvia Diouf. Talking about the early enslaved Africans who came here and still struggled. Many of them were Islamic jurists. Many of them were come from dignified families of Islamic learning, and them writing from memory Quran or tafsirs from memory for the next 20 to 30 years to keep that knowledge. And we have manuscripts of that, of early enslaved Africans who were Muslim, enduring that knowledge, and also this knowledge of farming and so forth that they brought from a highly developed civilizations in West Africa. So as Muslims, if we don't understand that as being part of our cultural heritage, our foundations of Islam in America, even in the throes of slavery, as people strive to always exert resistance against slavery, maintain their dignity, maintain their cultural connections and religious traditions, we are greatly deficient, but learning these will help people understand to maybe hopefully change their own paradigm about understanding of themselves, or again, part of the community that we claim to be our brothers and sisters of other racial backgrounds. Just a small suggestion from my side. I want to go to our next question. Actually, is directed to our brother Abed Ayub. Abed, one question that we received was, what is the most effective way, even coming from a secular organization or it aligns both secular and Arabs and also Muslims, what is a way, a suggestion to mobilize Masajid communities or communities of Muslims to work towards dismantling racist policing, whether they be out in the suburbs looking what's going on, core Black or recent new American African communities or so forth living in their inner cities or butting up with the police state. And I'm not gonna lie, there's a lot of Muslims out there in mosque saying, oh, we got to get this police to come in and teach us how to secure our mosque, or we have to take this Homeland Security money to learn how to secure our mosque, as if you can't call the Nation of Islam to teach you how to secure your mosque, who's been doing it for 90 years. But so how do they deal with police brutality and so forth, particularly from an ally or a solidarity position? So, yeah.
Thank you. And that's a great question. And also what I'll also touch upon real quick is the conversation we really didn't get into about, the owners of the convenience stores and the businesses in predominantly Black neighborhoods, right? Where police are often called for, things that really could be handled otherwise, right? I think, to mobilize a community, first thing and the most important thing is to educate the community. A lot of the immigrant communities coming in here don't have an understanding or a history of the police or a history of police violence in this country and what's going on. They only their only knowledge of it is whether, at the convenience store calling 911 or what they see on TV, or they may have never had a situation that directly impacted them, right? So that's why it's important on the ground to team up and connect with, organizations that are working on these issues and try to develop, what the agenda is and how you can be an ally and push that forward. The other piece of it is the anti-racism work. We got to have our community start looking at alternatives to calling the police. We got to have for our business owners de-escalation exercises. We got to have for, folks that live in neighborhoods, if they see a Black man walking down the street, don't get nervous about it. Don't call 911. I know that sounds brash, but that's the reality. This is the reality of a lot of these individuals. They got to have an understanding of the damage calling 911 or the damage calling police can have and the impact it can have. So there's got to be some frank conversations. I know people use the term, difficult conversations, regardless, whatever you want to call them, they're conversations that need to happen. We need to reach out to our community members, to the mosques, whether it be a Friday prayer or programs on their own, and start talking about what role we can play, how we could be good allies, how we could be, stand in support and solidarity of these communities, and for the business owners. And we can have a whole other webinar on this. But for the business owners, how to engage in some de-escalation practices and exercises, and implement some de-escalation measures in these businesses. And that, that's not even getting into the conversation of, providing, healthier options in your convenience store, providing better opportunities, better, business models to use in the, in the Black neighborhoods. That's a separate conversation, but just focused on the policing. The core of it is going to be some education, conversation, and then connecting with and following the lead of, as you said, Jad, of communities and groups that have been doing this work for decades. It's not new work. It's been there. Just take an effort to read and to understand the history and learn from those that have gone through this, and learn from those that are going, through this directly, and what you could do to help push a unified agenda forward.
Thank you, Abid. I'm going to pose a question that is both to both our good Reverend Hagler and to Sheikh Jaffer. Reverend, many of our imams, that we have to be truthful, we have to be honest, where even particularly a lot of imams or sheikhs that are at major masjids, some communities, there's been a practice for the past 20, 30 years of bringing in immigrant imams and scholars from other countries who don't know the lay of the land of America. They're not trained out to be public affairs imams and to address systemic racism, or doing the coalition that we may see in the prophetic Black church, or even Father, Flager in Southside Chicago. Do you have any recommendations of any type of networks, organizations where, with at least there being increasing numbers of interfaith engagement in the cities, which may be around just having dinners and talking about, oh, I'm Muslim, you're Christian, but more of a practical about the public issues, the social issues? What type of networks or trainings or organizations out there would you recommend many of our imams and sheikhs and scholars to get connected with, or even resources, a book or two that these should maybe reference and learn that gives them that language of faith, social justice type of work? Your suggestions on that?
Well, that's an interesting subject because it's harder said than done. And one of the things being is that very often when you have people who are immigrants, they really don't understand the nature of racism in America and white supremacy in America. And so, they buy into the cliches. Well, y'all just don't work hard enough. You're lazy, you're right. All the other types of things. Few things that exist, because most of the folks I work with, we've been in the battlefield together. I mean, so we don't have no theological problems. We out there fighting together, struggling together. I even think about my good friend. He's a little disabled, but Imam Mahdi Bray. We worked together over the years, and Imam Jahari Abdul Malik, those are folks that every time they call on me, every time I call on them, we're there, because there's that trust, right? We're in the battle together. Imam Nahidian down in Manassas, Virginia, right? We're in the battle together, and we have a different trust level. And I think what happens with half these interfaith groups, if folk get together to sing kumbaya, as we call it, right? Which means that, you got a pretend truce going on, and you ain't gonna do nothing together. Particularly, you're not gonna do anything that's controversial together. I mean, it's like right now having an interfaith group that refuses to discuss Palestine. How you not gonna talk about that major human rights issue, but you're not gonna talk about it because you want to have this little truce, if I can put it that way. So so it's you have peace, but in that case, peace is absent of justice. I point to things like, though, that you can get into, like Reverend William Barber from the Poor People's Campaign. He's a good friend of mine. We go back a ways, but that's one thing in which they've deliberately tried to do the interfaith piece with substance. Meaning it's about issues, it's about immigrant rights, it's about poverty issues, it's about the environment. I mean, it's about those things. And so you have a lot of people that don't join in because it's about something. But I think the one thing that the immigrant community can do is, how when folks become naturalized as US citizens and they go through the indoctrination period, I think you got to have folks indoctrinating your own as they come in and say, look, let me give you the real dope on what's going on in the United States. Right? They're gonna feed you all this stuff. Yeah, we know you got to do it because you're gonna be naturalized, become a citizen. But just understand that there's another story. I think that's what happened. And then, and I say that because one of the things that graphically hit me, and I'm gonna finish on this, was in DC, most of the 7-Elevens have been taken over by Ethiopians, right? Prior to Ethiopians, it were Indians, right? And because it had gone through basically, and prior to them was Koreans. So Koreans, Well, I was in a place the other day, and brother looks at Ethiopian cashier and says, you're my sister, right? And she looks at him, she says, no, I'm not your sister. He says, well, I'm from Africa. He reached back. She said, no, you're not from Africa. Denying his whole understanding of himself. Because again, people get trained and thinking that I'm different. I'm different than that narrative. And that's what we got to break people out of and get people to understand that they're going to eventually go after you too. Because she might be Ethiopian right now, but a generation later, her kid's going to be Black.
Oh. Well, Reverend, thank you for sharing that. And also, lifting up that important campaign, Reverend Barber, with the Poor People's Campaign, which has been going for a good 2 years. And I've been on calls with him. I do highly recommend, if you are in a sheikh or alim or imam on this call, you've never heard of that, I hope you have. Hey, they're having action coming up next week. I know if you're associated with ICNA Justice, they're promoting the Poor People's Campaign. Get involved, even the South Asian Muslim community. And you also lift up the good name of our good brothers, Imam Johari and Imam Matthew Bray here in DC, who themselves are traditionally trained community organizers in their communities, working with faith in action organizations and groups. If you're a imam or your imam is not at your mosque part of trained in community organizing, get them involved with the groups called Faith in Action, which is national level. It used to be called PICO, or even do the old school Industrial Areas Foundation community organizing. And they'll definitely learn a lot with other faith leaders in those networks. And that's a recommendation, especially with people like Imam Johari and Matthew Bray being clear examples of that type of leadership. Sheikh Jafar, I'm thinking right now of even the Prophet, when he moved to Medina, and the Ansar and the Muhajirun, just pairing brothers together and sisters together. Is there a tradition? Is there something wrong? Would there be someone who's coming from the Dale Bundy or being taught in Qom, or someone being taught at al-Asr? Would it be offensive for them to be here and say, oh, I have to sit down and learn from my Jewish rabbi or father preacher down the street to learn how to live my faith better in social justice? Is there any impediment from that? What's the tradition from the Prophet or the Imams or the Ahl Bayt of this type of dialogue and learning if all truth comes from Allah? That's what I'm trying to want to understand.
Yes. I believe that as Reverend Hagler, he stated, this is something that is easier said than done. But of course, when we talk about the Prophet and Imams, again, because of their special connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, they had no need to sit down and do this. But nonetheless, when we look at their advice, or even when we look at the Quran itself, it pushes us towards social justice and standing up for the oppressed. So if you find allies who are also standing up for justice and standing up for oppressed, then again, we have to join with them in order to stand with the oppressed and help them to gain justice. And I believe that based on that question, that many of the imams who immigrate here, if they are not able to identify an organization that they can work with, at the very least, they need to sit down with the Reverend Haglers and Reverend Barbara, who, again, they are the veterans of the struggle. Sit and speak with, even Al Sharpton, I would say, understand, just simply to understand the history. They need to understand that what has transpired and what folks have gone through. And I'll quote Al Sharpton, Reverend Al Sharpton here, because he said it so nicely and it's so true, that he says, when the officer had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, he says, this is so symbolic. They have their knee on us the whole time, and they still have their knee on us. Take your knee off of our neck, not just off the neck of George Floyd, but off of our neck. So in order to understand what exactly to do here in America, they have to sit down and speak with the Reverend Haglers and those who are like him, who have again understood America, understood the ideology of white supremacy, and understand how to tackle it.
No, thank you, Sheikh. And before we start to close out the video, and I would also say, as I mentioned earlier, and a child shall lead them. A lot of our youth, they are themselves, whether in college campuses or working in community organizations now outside the Muslim frame, are learning from Jewish rabbis and Christian preachers in their, interfaith engagement. Maybe it will behoove some of our imams and alims and sheikh and ustadas and ustads and chaplains to actually ask some of these youth, who are they learning from? Humbling themselves, me humbling myself. I'm not a sheikh or anything, but learning from who I should be maybe connecting with to develop that interfaith language of social justice. So that's a recommendation to those listening. Again, especially for youth, you are in leadership, and how you can even good nasiha to some of our sheikhs. They're students themselves. They need to be constantly learning just as much as we try to learn our deen also. So we're going to actually move into a video right now, which as we start to wind down, we have a brief video that we're going to share. Now we'll just have some closing remarks and have our last closing remarks speaker just for a couple of minutes as we go forward. So please, technician, video, please.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Dear sisters and brothers in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me begin with the ayat of Quran from Surah Al-Hujurat, ayat number 13, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. God has created us all differently. There is no denying it. And there are some qualities. When we dig down deeper, we will find that some people are superior to others. People will say this difference doesn't exist. Everyone is equal. But really, we all know this isn't the case. The simple fact is that some people have achieved higher level of Iman and Taqwa. And if you were nodding your head in agreement to my previous sentences, thinking it was about race and not Iman and Taqwa, then you are part of the problem. As human beings, we prefer to see variety in everything around us. This is perhaps a reflection of the practice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the way diversity is manifest throughout the universe. The most comprehensive verse is from chapter 35, ayat 27 and 28, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about diversity in vegetation, inanimate objects, and living beings. ألم تر أن الله أنزل من السماء ماء فأخرجنا به ثمرات مختلفا ألوانها. He says, don't you see that Allah sends down rain from the clouds? We bring forth with it fruits of various colors, and of course tests and shapes also. ومن الجبال جدد بيض وحمر مختلف ألوانها وغرابيب سود. Don't you also see that they are in the mountains, stripes of white and red and of various colors, including intense black? And then he goes on to say, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ وَالدَّوَّابِ وَالْأَنْعَامِ مُخْتَلِفًا أَلْوَانُهَا. He says, and also among the people, the animals and the cattle, they are different colors. And verily, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاءِ, and verily only the learned ones from Allah's servants truly fear Him. Verily Allah is powerful and forgiving. So when we look at this issue of diversity in human race, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically talks about it when He refers to the diversity of languages and colors that we possess. In chapter 30 of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lists some of these signs of His power and glory. In verse 22 He says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. He says, and also from His signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, وَإِخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ, and the diversity of your languages and colors. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالِمِينَ. Verily in this are signs for those who are learned in science and language and in human behavior. So diversity in human race, color and language is not a negative attribute. Rather it is a point of reflection for mature beings who possess true knowledge. In verse 13 of Surah 49, addressing the human beings in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nas, O the people, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. We have verily created you from a male and a female. Allah could have skipped the process of reproduction and we all could have been created in the same manner. However, Allah also enjoys diversity. And so He says further, and we have made you into shu'uban wa qaba'ila, and we have made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Despite the fact that all human beings are children of Adam and Eve, we all are part of unique histories and cultures. So diversity in color, features, and language are signs of God's power and glory. This is a fact that should be explored, shared, and celebrated, not degraded, humiliated, or erased. Problems begin when our colors, features, language, nationality, or our tribe or race are used to create an ill-perceived societal hierarchy. When we start considering one superior over the other on racial basis, we are in direct conflict with Allah's teaching. There is no concept of a pure or chosen race in the human family. All are from Adam and Eve. There are some communities who devote many resources in the name of preserving and protecting their language, culture, and way of life. And it is important to have a recorded history that future generations can refer to. However, when it reaches a level where you consider yourself superior to others, a level where you look down upon an entire race, a level where you exhibit an instinct of disgust at being seated beside someone different or praying behind someone of a different color, that is when you have strayed from cultural preservation to cultural aggression. If you are genuinely looking for a criterion of preferring one person over another, then you should look at the next sentence in that verse 13 of Surah 49, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna akramakum 'inda Allahi atqakum, where He states that the criterion of superiority over others is taqwa, righteousness, the inner power which keeps you constantly aware of God's presence in your life and prevents you from giving into the temptation to commit sins. One of the serious ones is racist words and actions. Moreover, this cannot be the standard of quality of a tribe or a nation. This is a trait of individuals. Those individuals could be of varying skin tones, tall or short, rich or poor, because taqwa as an inner power has no color. Let me end with a story which has been narrated by Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam, where he talks about an incident during the days of the Prophet. He says, one day the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam were sitting around, and yantasibuna wa yaftakhiruna. They were, describing their own genealogy, their ancestry, and bragging about it and feeling, proud against the others. And in that gathering was Salman also. And remember, he was an outsider as far as the tribe and the race is concerned. So one of the companions by the name of Umar, he said, "Ma nisbatuka anta ya Salman wa ma asluka?" What is your genealogy, O Salman? What is your origin? And this is where Salman responded in a very beautiful way. He says, "Ana Salman bin Abdullah." I am Salman, the son of the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كنت ضالا فهداني الله بمحمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. I was lost, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided me through Muhammad. وكنت عائلا فأغناني الله بمحمد. And I was poor, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made me free from need through Muhammad صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. وكنت مملوكا فَعَاتَقَنِي اللَّهُ بِمُحَمَّدٍ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ وَسَلَّمَ. I was a slave, but I became free. Allah made me free through Muhammad صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. فَهَذَا حَسَبِي وَنَسَبِي يَا عُمَرَ. This is my honor, and this is my origin, or Umar. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came outside from his home, and Salman described the conversation that he had with the companions. And this is where the Prophet then addressed the companions, especially those who were from Arab and Quraysh. He says, "Ya ma'ashar Quraysh, O people of Quraysh, the honor of a person is his faith, his virtue is his character, and his origin is his intelligence." Then the Prophet recited this ayat from Surah 49, ayat number 13, and then he says, "Ya Salman, O Salman, none of these people have any superiority over you except by taqwa. So if you are more righteous compared to another person, then you are superior to that. So no nation or race has the right to claim superiority over others based on artificial standards of color or culture. Purifying our minds and hearts of this false criterion is the first and the most fundamental step in combating racism. This starts with yourself internally, trying to change your mindset. It continues within your family. Call out your parents, siblings, or spouse for any obvious or subliminal prejudicial mindsets or comments. And from there, move on to your children and those around you. Break the circle of hate and avoid passing on values that don't align with Allah's teaching. The only way we can build a better tomorrow is by working on it today. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to be among the true followers of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad salawatullah alayhi ajma'een. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. I want to just take a few minutes and to say we thank Syed Maulana Rizvi from Toronto. He is one of the distinguished alims and scholars that we have here in North America, from a distinguished line of scholars. He is very much one of the deans of the ulama, no matter which school of thought or jurisprudence you come from America. In America, he is a resource to all of us. So we thank him for providing that really brief but comprehensive worldview based upon the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet of how we understand the diversity of humanity and how we're to understand it as a blessing, and how to be critical in our analysis of how to appreciate it, respect for what it is, and how to purify ourselves when, again, those shaitani systems creep upon us. So I'm in my last few minutes. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank particularly our speakers who've all come and shared, taking time out of their weekends away from their families to be a resource to you, to all of us, in giving us guidance for our, good Reverend Hagler, Dr. Mona, Sheikh Jaffa, and our good brother Abed Ayub. We thank you. May Allah sustain you, protect you, and give you blessings for the good that you do in this world. And may we all who've been on, stand with you and strive to create a more beautiful, more free, more equitable world, and understanding it through our role in that as Muslims, as humans. Again, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Again, taking 2 hours of your time into being with us. We hope this was beneficial for you. The Stand for Justice DMV, this is the first of many programs to come. We look forward to being a resource to you. And please share with your family and friends future notices for programs. So we're going to finish out now. Just a few comments from our last distinguished speaker, who's going to close out with a brief reflection. We've had, yes, Sheikh Jaffa, now Maulana Rizvi from Toronto, and now we're joined by our good friend, Syed Suleiman Hassan. Again, along with Sheikh Jaffa, one of the distinguished and the emerging young scholars that our community deserves. And we thank them for the commitment they've made and to receive religious learning, but also understanding and engagement with public issues. Sheikh Suleiman has spent many years studying in Hausa, has completed his PhD in Islamic studies from the University of Chicago, and spent just the past few years also being the resident alim professor at Beit al-Ilm, which is a seminary for Islamic learning in the greater Chicago area. But just for particularly our community here, we have the blessings. He has roots here in the DMV, and he has returned to become the resident alim at one of the local masjids in Northern Virginia. And I look so much forward to being engaging with him. But we're going to give our closing out. These are my final words. Thank you to everyone. Again, as I said, may I be a resource to you and the work that I do. There's ways to connect with me. I look forward to engaging. But Sheikh Hassan Suleiman, please. And that will, after Sheikh Suleiman, that will be the formal end of the program, but there will be video statements going on after our formal comments that if you want to stay on and listen out of your own viewing pleasure, they're there for you. Statements of solidarity from various religious leaders, community leaders, and so forth. But if you need to move on, we understand. But at the, Syed Suleiman will give the final formal remarks of the program. Syed Suleiman, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with the name of God, the kind, the merciful. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with all of you. We have gone a little bit over our allotted time, and that's because we had a very rich discussion and a very beneficial panel. So thank you to all of you who shared your wisdom, experience, and insights. I know I learned, and I think all of us did learn. And the technical difficulties at the beginning, I apologize for them, but hopefully all of the information will be available. And I do encourage those of you who are able to listen to the statements of solidarity that we will be playing at the end of this program. Those statements of solidarity from members of our community, young and old, they are what will, inshallah, keep this cause going, flourishing, and expanding, inshallah, until it is able to achieve the results that we are all seeking. In closing, I think the one thing that comes to my mind, and maybe many people, is this movement is so long overdue in our society. It's a wonder, and I think Reverend Hagler hinted at perhaps some of the causes when you quoted LBJ. But it's a wonder that in this wealthiest of societies, there is so much hunger, there is so much homelessness, there is so much oppression, there are never-ending wars, and yet there hasn't been the kind of inspiring mass movement, at least within the memory that, that somebody of my age would have, against all of that oppression and that suffering. And when I mean mass movement, I mean a sustained mass movement that brings results. There have been many movements, and I don't want to trivialize that in any way. And those of us who believe in God, we believe in providence. And we believe that when there is a spark that starts a mass movement, that is according to the plan and the wisdom of God. And I truly believe that this movement that we have the honor of witnessing and being a part of is part of God's infinitely wise plan. Because there are many of us who may have known about and spoken about the education crisis, the employment crisis, the housing crisis, the never-ending disasters of foreign policy. And when we talk about the model minority that Dr. Masood spoke about eloquently, there's also an aspect of that oppression that goes back to the countries that those immigrants come from, and that immigrants in this country also sometimes unwittingly tie into and support. And so all of these different movements, they could have and need to connect to a struggle for justice. But I see the hand of God and the wisdom of God in the fact that we started from Black Lives Matter, because this is the history of this country, that when there is a recognition of the oppression that exists within society, a few people are taken from the top, given a portion of what they are seeking, maybe some economic rights, some social rights, and then that is used to perpetuate the victimization of the rest of those who are suffering. And for too long, it has been the Black community that has always been left without any of its just demands being met. If you look at the history of this country with the Federal Housing Authority, or with the Social Security Act, or with the National Labor Relations Act, the GI Bill, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of the 1980s, even the Affordable Care Act within all of our own time. And I could go on, but many of you may be familiar with this. There is a reason why we have an Affordable Care Act, but a lot of people still lack insurance, and many of those who have it are underinsured. There is a reason why we had a war on drugs, but we have a never-ending or an increasing drug problem. And the hand of God is that this movement represents not the skimming off the middle class, so they see their interests as being separated from the rest of those who are oppressed, or the model minority, but as, and I don't want to quote scripture when there is a reverend here. If my reference is mistaken, please correct me. But if I'm not mistaken, in Matthew 25:40, there is that very beautiful statement that truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And we have an Islamic tradition where God says that what you do for those who are at the bottom of society, that you have done not for that person, but you have done for God. And that reminds me of another tradition from the family of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon all of them, a wasiya, a will, made on the deathbed by the fifth Imam of the Muslims, the grandson of the Prophet, which he said was the will of my father, my grandfather, and Imam Ali, the heir of Prophet Muhammad. Beware of doing wrong to somebody who finds no one to help them against you but God, because that person has the strongest support. They have God by their side and God at their back. And so it is a beautiful thing for us to be able to live at a time when that realization comes. Through our faith, let us remember that this is not an economic struggle, not a social struggle or a civil struggle. It is first and foremost a spiritual struggle for dignity and for recognizing and respecting the value of all of God's creation in the human family and in the world around us, in nature and in the environment as well. And I will close, and I know that we are well over time, but with just one thought. It would be a tragedy for this to become a purely political struggle. And Brother Abid, you mentioned that we do have to think about how we translate our work on the political level, and that is important. But we shouldn't reduce our work to that political level. The destiny of a society is decided not in its halls of power, but in the hearts of its people. And solutions lie not in the decisions of a court or in votes at a ballot box, but in the dreams within us and the values that we live out. Let us have dreams and let us live values that are worthy of our spiritual and our religious traditions. Peace be with all of you. And we will now have statements of solidarity. I encourage all of you to tune into those. And once again, thank you to all of you who shared your insights and those of you who listened to this program.
Ar-Rahman-Ar-Rahim, and of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and of the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs from those of knowledge. Surah 30, Ayah 22.
All people are the same in the eyes of Allah.
The ideas of social justice supported by the Declaration of Independence on which this country was established, but more importantly Islam, show us that we must take a stand, whether that be through social media presence, signing petitions, or keeping up to date with our world in order to continue our struggle for justice. In the case of social injustice, we must use our voices to generate a change, and striving towards a common goal is one way to end social injustices around us. It is our job to stand with our African American brothers and sisters against the unjust police brutality they face, alongside the establishment and systemic racism that has kept African Americans subdued in society. Although I have color in my skin and I'm part of a minority, I will never understand the struggle of being African American no matter how hard I try. Empathy is important, but there needs to be action first. There must be change, and not just through legislation, but through widespread ideas and beliefs that are imperative to change so that we as Americans can say that all men are created equal and that the color of one's skin doesn't predetermine a person's worth.
Hi friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Mirza Askari Hussain. Originally I'm from India, based in Kuwait. I'm here to take part in the giant and the great protest in favor of George Floyd, a victim of cool blood murder in the United States of America. To take part in this protest, I would like to give few words and few suggestions. The words to the government personnels and the suggestions to the protesters. My words are as follow. United States of America is said to be among one of the greatest democracy in the world. United States is said to be one of the greatest place where the diversity of culture, color, languages are very apparent and significant. United States of America, the government of United States of America claims to lead the world in terms of justice and humanity. United States of America claims to fight against terrorism and fights to remove the terrorism. So now I have few questions. If United States of America is among the most democratic country in the world, so why democracy is being crushed now? If United States of America is said and claim, and it's actually means a hub of diversity of cultures, so why a few communities are being crushed and are being deprived of their rights? If United States of America claim to lead the world in terms of justice and to remove terrorism, so why its own people are being terrorized? This is my questions, and I'm really ashamed to see what is happening in the United States of America. My suggestions to the protesters, they're protesters. People across the world are with you. Definitely you protest for your rights. You must not be deprived of the right. What had happened with George Floyd, it is unacceptable and it is totally unjust. But I would like to suggest you, being a protester, that protest for your right with a justified attitude and a justified manner. Do not protest for justice with an unjust attitude and with an unjust activities. So please do not spoil the the public properties. Don't think that the public properties is owned by the government. Rather, government is a caretaker. The owner of the public properties is you yourself. So if you are spoiling and harming the public properties, you're harming yourself. So this was my suggestion to the protesters in the United States of America and across the world. I would like to end my suggestion and words with an hashtag that I am against the oppressors and I stand with the oppressed. Be blessed. Take care of yourself. Fight for your right. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ali Mohsin, and I will be sharing my thoughts on racial discrimination. Due to widespread injustice and unfair laws, many in this country have faced pain and suffering throughout the US history. Here are some of the contrasts between fiction and reality when we closely examine history. Harriet Tubman freed slaves, helping them cross a bridge of freedom, but still today, society has not crossed the bridge of prejudice and hate. In 1955, when Rosa Parks stood up for a seat on the bus, even today, society has not given the seat of rights to blacks and other minorities in this free country. Dr. King marched through the streets of this free country to raise voices for oppressed black communities. On the same streets today, many innocent blacks are still unable to breathe due to unjust forces. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Although it changed the Constitution on paper, it was not fully able to change the equation of racial and social equality. When the 13th Amendment was passed, it enacted to remove chains from the necks of African slaves. But today, the same necks are tied with the ropes of social injustice. Today, many are still fighting for the same causes since the 1600s. Lifestyle has changed, but the ideology of the people remains the same. Say our names, remember our faces. Blacks and other minority lives matter. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Waqar Rizvi. I'm a news anchor, show host, and political analyst currently based in Pakistan. You may be wondering why anyone like myself would want to speak up about systemic racism against the black community in the United States. Well, the reason is quite simple. It's almost been engraved into the rest of us, hasn't it, around the world, through both the power of media, be it Hollywood or news, and the ramifications of colonialism. Now, as a child growing up in Canada, I remember I had a black classmate in grade 6 with whom I went to a grocery store once after school. Now, I'd been to that very store numerous times alone and had never been followed by a store clerk at that time. Now, this time, though, was different. I remember the feeling of great discomfort throughout. He, though, acted like it was nothing. And that story has really stuck with me. That incident has really stuck with me. Media, too, often reflects this, even around the world. Often you'll see more white faces than black discussing issues which primarily actually affect the latter. Why is it that, one wonders? Then, of course, there's the issue of simple skin tone and the perception of criminality that comes along with it. This isn't easy for me to actually admit and say, but the truth is that fair skin is not only linked to beauty, which in and of itself is very sad, by the way. Even around the world, many will tell their children to steer clear of black neighborhoods because, again, of perceived high rates of crime. None of us stop to actually contextualize what has actually happened to the black community, be it in the US or in our own countries, and most importantly, in our perceptions. Now, the talk of rioting instead of the true issue at hand is so indicative of that. As Martin Luther King Jr. had said so many years back, and I'm quoting him now, I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots, end quote. Address the root cause first, i.e. systematic racism, which is also exported around the world, and you'll take the first step, hopefully, towards true justice. Now, since I've worked in journalism, the names have piled up, haven't they, in what are more and more heartbreaking displays of racism, from Eric Garner to now George Floyd and even the child Tamir Rice. Those images are really seared in my mind. Each such video and incident and the emotional toll left behind on families and communities strengthens the need for a re-evaluation of our values and ideologies. Why are we okay with this? Where is the international community's voice? Why are we all afraid to admit what we know is actually wrong? Those are the questions that will haunt us all as the bodies of all these innocents continue to pile up. The time is now. Thank you.
As an American Muslim, I believe that we are all equal because in the Quran, Allah says we are all equal. No one is better than anyone. We should all be treated fairly no matter what our color, race, or religion is. People should not think someone is bad just because of the color of their skin. Everyone has a mind and conscience to think what's right and wrong, whereas people should not assume that someone is bad or untrustworthy, like those police officers thought of George Floyd before his death. Even the law states that all American citizens should be treated equally. The only people Allah differentiates as better are the people who do good deeds, not because of their skin color.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib reminds us of an important responsibility that we have in society. We can take this lesson and apply it at all times, at all eras, in all places. And it's very relevant to the climate that we're living in today, where people are just beginning to awake to the realities of social injustice, in particular to racism, in particular to police brutality, and the racism that African Americans experience in the United States of America. What did Imam Ali say? He said, stand against the zalim, against the oppressor, and be a helper to the mazloom, to the one who is oppressed. This means that there can be no quiet bystanders. You can't sit back and watch things happen and unfold and transpire and people suffer and not feel any obligation to do anything. If we do feel indifferent or we do feel not enraged by this kind of injustice, like murdering a man by putting your knee on his neck while he pleads for his life, as an officer whose job is to protect and serve, while other officers are doing what? What are the other officers doing? They're just chilling. They're watching. They're bystanding. They're allowing the oppression and the murder to happen. They became accomplices in this murder. Please think about the event that happened in Karbala. There was a group who is mentioned, Ummatan Qatalatk. There's a group that they murdered Imam Hussein, peace be upon him, and his companions. There was a group, Sama'at wa radiyat bih, or wa radiyat bidhalik. There was a group that heard the cry, Hal min nasirin yansuruni? Is there anyone to help us? But they were okay with it. They were content with it. So the only question, if we want to, now about those two groups, they're both cursed groups. If we don't want to be in the category of the accursed, then we can't be bystanders. What should we do? This is where we need to be connected to our leadership people who understand Islam, but also understand the culture and the circumstances of society. You need more details, you need more education, not limited to this video, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any way I can so that we can be true Muslims, an educated force, a unit which makes a difference against the injustices and the ills that exist in society. I'm hearing a lot of different things in terms of what practical things we can do. And I have my thoughts on some of the important practical things we can do. And if you're interested, please reach out and I can share some more details with you, or you can look at some of the recent videos that have been made this past week. Most of them are available on social media, and try to see and understand what are the best options of what you can do, inshallah. May Allah be with all of us and help us all to be true companions of the 12th Imam, Imam Mahdi Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif, be of his A'wan and his Ansar, his helpers, his supporters, the supporters of the Mazlumeen, and those who stand against the Zalimeen.
Layla Fatima Ali. As my name states, I am a follower of Ali and Fatima. Standing for justice is not a choice for me, but a responsibility. As a Shia Muslim, I should be speaking against injustice everywhere. It is a part of my faith. No justice, no peace.
Greetings, my name is Samana Jaffrey and I hold a master's degree in art therapy and counseling from George Washington University. First of all, I would like to use this opportunity to show solidarity with the African American community in these difficult days. Then, I would like to share a few thoughts regarding the African American community and counseling and art therapy. Let us first define racism. Racism is the discrimination against a person based on different race, skin color, language, customs, etc. To understand the challenges faced by African Americans and their therapists during counseling, a little background in history would be relevant. In the history of the United States, people of African heritage have been specially discriminated and marginalized. Brought into the United States in slavery, they were required and expected to remain completely subordinate. That mentality did not change even when slavery was abolished. African Americans were kept from feeling proud of their race and culture by the actions of whites in order to keep an upper hand. Centuries of systematic suppression and discrimination have resulted in various unique psychological pressures in the Black community, to which there are a variety of responses. It is common for many Black clients to feel angry and defiant towards a society in which their mistreatment is normalized. How these feelings translate to their perception of social change often differs drastically by the client's socioeconomic status and life history. Relatively socioeconomically stable clients usually find it easier to believe the idea that change is best accomplished within the system by means of peaceful protests and community engagement. However, the more you're thrown against a wall, the more you're hurt. And clients with harder lives often express frustration due to the feeling that they have little real agency over their society, and that their lives largely feel like a death match between them and the world. Society in general, and the police force in particular, have failed to accept and honor these feelings. Some of the essential themes that need to be addressed in counseling with the African American population include, firstly, the basic need to be heard and understood. Secondly, how ethnic identity influences therapy. And lastly, being held to a different standard on top of all the odds stacked against them. I'm glad to see that initiatives such as Stand for Justice are providing a platform for giving a voice to the marginalized, and therefore helping address the discrimination and oppression prevalent in our society. I hope to see more changes coming in future because of these initiatives. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mona Suleiman. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice in Alexandria, Virginia. I wanted to talk for a minute about implicit bias. The current awareness of the police and societal racial inequalities beg the question of why certain people who don't appear to be racist act in such prejudicial ways. Psychologists believe that the answer to this lies in something called an implicit bias. Implicit bias is our unique set of stereotypes and assumptions that we develop through our life from information that we've gathered from our parents and media about other races, and if we do nothing and don't challenge them, they'll continue to remain in our minds. One way to combat racism is by addressing our own implicit biases, by being aware of them. And some of the ways that we can do this is to ask ourselves challenging questions and wonder what other people in different situations would feel and think, try to think of outside of ourselves. That's called perspective taking. And by challenging our own assumptions and beliefs about a particular race, we need to stop and take note when our what experiences actually challenge what these stereotypes are. So if something that goes against your stereotypes occurs, hopefully it would be a positive experience, and that's something that we need to acknowledge and make note of in an effort to try to challenge and change our implicit bias. Another way to challenge our implicit bias is very simply by interacting with people that we're unfamiliar with, to increase our awareness of those and experiences of those that are different from us. So I think through understanding and acknowledging our own implicit biases, then we can slowly try to make a difference in changing the way that we interact with others and sometimes be more aware of the subconscious messages that we give ourselves when we're interacting with people that are different from ourselves. Thank you.
In the name of Allah, the All-Compassionate, the All-Merciful, Assalamu alaikum, my dear Muslim brothers and sisters. We are right now lucky to be alive in a time where the world is crying out for justice. More specifically, in America right now, we are tired of seeing innocent black men and women being abused by our justice system. As Muslims, we know that Islam is a religion of justice, and we know that we must care about racial discrimination. In the Holy Quran, God tells us, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it's against yourselves or your parents and relatives, whether one is rich or poor, Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not personal inclination, lest you not be just, and if you distort your testimony or refuse to give it, then indeed Allah is ever what you do acquainted. And we know that as Muslims who care about justice, that we must also care about the problem of racial discrimination, because it is a matter of injustice happening and we must fix that. And the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, tells us, whoever possesses in his heart asbiya, even to the extent of a mustard seed, God will raise him on the day of resurrection with the pagans. This is no small statement, and we need to take time to ponder on it. Now, unfortunately, despite the many hadiths, despite the many Quranic verses telling us that there is no room, no space in our Muslim communities for racism, we know that racism does exist within our masjids, within our Islamic centers and communities. Step one is understanding what racism is. This right here is not racism. We have an idea of what a racist person looks like in our minds, and it's often a very, very violent, disturbing image. And although, yes, this person is a racist, whenever we have this as the idea of racism, we neglect to look at ourselves. If we break this down, essentially racism is our own internal bias against a different race. And oftentimes we don't think that we're racist or someone that we know who we love is racist because there's no violence. But racism is just a matter of the bias that we have. Brothers and sisters, we have to accept that every single person has their own bias. We have our own biases, and having your own racial bias doesn't make you an evil person. And there are good people who are racist. But the only way for us to tackle this problem is us to first acknowledge that it exists, instead of pretending that it doesn't exist, that we're all perfect, that no one in the community is racist, no community leaders or people who attend our programs are racist. This is simply not the case. Step number 2, after step 1, which was acknowledging that we have biases, we must now acknowledge what our biases are. We must examine them deeply, look into them, try to understand them. The more we understand them, the more we understand ourselves, we can eradicate this problem slowly, inshallah. I'll use that racism oftentimes disguises itself as logic. Racist people don't think to themselves that they're being irrational, illogical people. They really believe that they're being logical. I mean, think back to the story that we all know where Shaitan would not bow down to Adam. Shaitan was using his own logic to say to himself that he is better than Adam. We think to ourselves that we're being safe, we're being logical. I think this is oftentimes the case whenever we think about black people. We often think about them as more aggressive, more dangerous, and we have to be wary of them. And I'm going to give you guys a good way of potentially avoiding this kind of issue. Think about this. If you're only looking to be cautious of one race of someone, it's a handicap. It's actually a way for someone to get behind you and use your own bias against you. Look up pictures online right now of school shooters, of serial killers. You will find that the vast majority of them are all white men. If you saw a man who looked like
I heard a quote today that really touched me. It's by Reverend Tracy Blackman. It's impossible to be unarmed when my blackness is the weapon that you fear. That just says it all. You know, how can we disarm ourselves? Doesn't matter what we're doing, you're still being black. And that can cost you your life, as you can see. Another quote that I like is that justice, that's the cake. That's the foundation. Peace is the frosting or the icing that you put on the cake. But you have to have the cake first. Justice has been the precondition for peace for many years.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. During these times, James Baldwin wrote a book, The Fire Next Time. The fire is now.